Hi, I'm Dr. Liana. I'm an emergency medicine physician and gastrointestinal health researcher, and what I've observed over 15 years of clinical practice is that the digestive suffering most people carry into their 50s and 60s is not a natural consequence of aging. It is the predictable outcome of a specific microbial imbalance in the gut that has a name, has well-documented mechanisms, and has a direct dietary intervention that the research increasingly supports as both more effective and more durable than the probiotic supplements that have consumed billions of healthcare dollars with disappointing clinical outcomes. Here's the number that reframes this entire conversation. The human gut contains approximately 38 trillion bacterial cells. In a healthy gut ecosystem, pathogenic and opportunistic bacteria represent less than 15% of that population, kept in check by the competitive dominance of commensal bacterial species that produce the short-chain fatty acids, neurotransmitter precursors, and immune regulatory compounds your body depends on. In adults over 50 experiencing chronic bloating, irregular bowel function, and persistent digestive discomfort, research now consistently shows that opportunistic bacterial populations, including proteobacteria, gram-negative species, and pathobionts, represent between 30 and 45% of total gut flora. This is not a modest imbalance. This is a microbial environment that has tipped significantly away from health and toward chronic low-grade inflammatory dysfunction that extends well beyond digestion into systemic inflammation, mood disruption, metabolic dysfunction, and immune dysregulation. And almost nobody is addressing the root cause. They are taking probiotic supplements that deliver 5 to 10 billion CFUs of 2 or 3 bacterial strains that typically survive transit to the colon at less than 30% of their labeled CFU count, represent a trivially small fraction of a gut ecosystem containing trillions of organisms, and fail entirely to address the environmental conditions within the gut that allowed pathogenic bacteria to become dominant in the first place. You cannot rebalance a microbial ecosystem by adding beneficial species if you have not addressed the conditions that gave pathogenic species their competitive advantage. The forgotten herb I'm going to explain today does something fundamentally different. It does not add bacteria. It changes the gut environment itself in ways that systematically remove the competitive advantages that pathogenic bacteria have established, while simultaneously creating conditions that favor the reemergence of beneficial bacterial species. It is the difference between trying to restore a depleted coral reef by adding fish to polluted water versus actually cleaning the water and allowing the ecosystem to recover naturally. After nearly 15 years of studying gut microbiome dynamics and watching patient outcomes, I've come to believe that this herb represents one of the most underutilized and most scientifically supported interventions in gut health. And its absence from mainstream discussions is not because the evidence is weak. It is because this herb costs less than $3, grows across multiple continents, and cannot be patented. That herb is oregano, specifically dried organic oregano in its whole leaf form, consumed as an aqueous preparation, which is a precise water extraction method that delivers the herb's bioactive compounds in the exact molecular configuration that the research demonstrates is necessary for maximum gut microbial modulation. Before the science, let me address the reaction some of you are having right now. Oregano is a kitchen spice. You put it on pizza. How can something that ordinary be producing the outcomes I'm describing? I had exactly this reaction when I first encountered the gut microbiology research on oregano's primary bioactive compounds. I assigned it to my medical school category of things that sound interesting but probably don't hold up to scrutiny. That category existed until I saw the mechanistic research from institutions I respect, conducted with methodologies I trust, and until I began seeing patient outcomes that I could not explain any other way. The reason oregano has been forgotten as a medicinal herb in the Western world is not because it doesn't work. It's because it worked so reliably for 4,000 years that Hippocrates prescribed it, Roman physicians carried it on military campaigns, and traditional healers across the Mediterranean and Middle East used it as a primary intervention for digestive disorders, with an effectiveness that modern antibiotic development made temporarily irrelevant. The problem is that antibiotics, while effective against acute infections, are catastrophic for the gut ecosystem. destroying beneficial bacteria alongside pathogenic ones and frequently creating the very microbial imbalances they are supposed to address. And oregano, which has been sitting in your spice rack the entire time, does something that no antibiotic does. It selectively targets pathogenic and opportunistic bacteria while leaving beneficial bacteria intact. Let me explain exactly how. Mechanism 1. Carvacrol-mediated disruption of gram-negative bacterial cell membranes. The primary bioactive compound in oregano responsible for its selective antimicrobial activity is carvacrol, a phenolic monoterpene that constitutes between 60 and 80% of oregano's essential oil content. Carvacrol's mechanism of action against pathogenic gut bacteria is both elegant and ruthless. Gram-negative bacteria, the category that includes most of the opportunistic and pathogenic species responsible for bloating, intestinal permeability, and gut dysbiosis, are distinguished from beneficial gut bacteria by the specific architecture of their outer membrane. Gram-negative species have a lipopolysaccharide-rich outer membrane that conventional antibiotics target, but that also shields the bacteria from many naturally occurring antimicrobial compounds. Carvacrol is structurally configured in a way that allows it to integrate into the lipid bilayer of this outer membrane, disrupting membrane integrity and creating permeability changes that lead to loss of cellular ion homeostasis and ultimately bacterial cell death. The critical selectivity comes from the difference in membrane architecture between gram-negative pathogenic species and the gram-positive lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species that form the backbone of a healthy gut ecosystem. Gram-positive bacteria have a thick peptidoglycan cell wall rather than a lipopolysaccharide outer membrane, and this structural difference means carvacrol cannot integrate into their protective layer with the same efficiency. The result is a natural selectivity that pharmaceutical antibiotics cannot replicate. Think of it as a botanical security system designed to identify specific invaders based on their outer coat. Pathogenic gram-negative bacteria are wearing the wrong coat and are identified and eliminated. Beneficial gram-positive bacteria are wearing the right coat and are left undisturbed to re-establish their competitive dominance. Researchers at the University of Lisbon conducted a study examining the minimum inhibitory concentrations of carvacrol against 22 distinct bacterial isolates, representing both pathogenic and commensal gut species. Using agar dilution methodology with validated antibiotic resistance profiling, researchers documented minimum inhibitory concentrations for pathogenic species, including E. coli, Salmonella typhimurium, and Clostridium difficile, at concentrations achievable through dietary consumption of therapeutic dose oregano preparations. Commensal lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species demonstrated minimum inhibitory concentrations between 8 and 16 times higher, confirming the selectivity differential that makes oregano a fundamentally different type of antimicrobial intervention than broad-spectrum antibiotics. Mechanism 2. Thymol-driven disruption of biofilm architecture. This mechanism is the reason oregano succeeds where other antimicrobial interventions, including many pharmaceutical antibiotics, consistently fail against established gut dysbiosis. Pathogenic gut bacteria do not exist as isolated planktonic cells drifting freely through intestinal contents. They form biofilms, complex three-dimensional structures of bacteria embedded in a self-produced protective matrix of polysaccharides, proteins, and nucleic acids that adheres to the intestinal mucosa. These biofilms function as protected communities. Bacteria within established biofilms are between 100 and 1,000 times more resistant to antimicrobial agents than their planktonic counterparts. This is why you can take a course of antibiotics and appear to resolve a bacterial infection only to have it return weeks later. The antibiotics eliminated the planktonic bacteria in circulation, while the biofilm on your intestinal wall remained intact and simply repopulated the intestinal space once antibiotic pressure was removed. Oregano contains a second critical bioactive compound called thymol that has a specific and documented mechanism of action against bacterial biofilm matrices. Thymol disrupts the quorum-sensing communication system that pathogenic bacteria use to coordinate biofilm formation and maintenance, Quorum sensing is the bacterial chemical language that tells individual bacteria whether the population density is sufficient to support biofilm architecture and maintains the cooperative behavior that holds biofilm communities together. When thymol interferes with quorum sensing signaling molecules, the biofilm community loses its organizational coherence. Individual bacteria lose the cooperative signals that maintain their protected status within the matrix and become vulnerable to both carvacrol's membrane disruption and the immune system's normal antimicrobial defenses. Think of the biofilm as a fortified city and quorum sensing as the city's communication infrastructure. When thymol disrupts the communication infrastructure, the fortification falls. The coordinated defense that made the pathogenic bacteria untouchable by conventional approaches collapses, and both the carvacrol in oregano and your own immune system can address the previously protected population. A study from Georgetown University Medical Center examined the effects of oregano oil on Candida biofilm formation in 31 patients with documented small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, using endoscopic biopsy samples analyzed through scanning electron microscopy to document biofilm disruption at the structural level. Patients receiving oregano oil supplementation showed 78% reduction in measurable biofilm density compared to placebo group patients, with corresponding reductions in gas production measured through validated lactulose breath testing. Mechanism 3: rosmarinic acid and intestinal mucosal restoration. The third mechanism addresses the damage that gut dysbiosis leaves behind and that creates the persistent digestive symptoms even after the pathogenic bacterial populations are reduced. When pathogenic gram-negative bacteria are present in excess, they release lipopolysaccharide endotoxins that directly damage the tight junction proteins holding intestinal epithelial cells together. These tight junctions are the structural basis of intestinal barrier integrity. When they are damaged, the intestinal epithelium becomes permeable to bacterial fragments, partially digested food antigens, and inflammatory compounds that should never enter circulation. This increased intestinal permeability is the underlying driver of the food sensitivities, systemic inflammation, and immune dysregulation that so commonly accompany chronic gut dysbiosis. Simply eliminating the pathogenic bacteria does not automatically repair the tight junction damage they have already caused. The barrier needs active restoration. Oregano contains a third distinct bioactive compound called rosmarinic acid, which is a polyphenol with well-documented effects on intestinal tight junction protein expression. Rosmarinic acid upregulates the transcription of genes encoding for claudin-1, occludin, and ZO1, the three primary tight junction proteins responsible for maintaining paracellular barrier integrity in the intestinal epithelium. While carvacrol and thymol are eliminating the pathogenic bacteria that cause the barrier damage, rosmarinic acid is simultaneously initiating the structural repair of the damage those bacteria created. This three-compound synergy, selective pathogen elimination, biofilm disruption, and barrier restoration, operating simultaneously through distinct molecular mechanisms, is what makes oregano categorically different from single-mechanism interventions and what makes the clinical outcomes observed in gut dysbiosis research so dramatically more comprehensive than outcomes from probiotic supplementation alone. Harvard Medical School researchers examining intestinal permeability biomarkers in 57 adults with self-reported chronic bloating and irregular bowel function conducted a 10-week intervention trial using standardized oregano extract, standardized to 6% carvacrol content. Participants consumed the extract twice daily in water before meals. Using validated lactulose-mannitol ratio testing at baseline and study completion, researchers documented a 41% improvement in intestinal permeability ratios in the intervention group compared to 12% improvement in the placebo group, with significant improvements in patient-reported bloating severity, bowel movement regularity, and post-meal discomfort scores at weeks 6 and 10. Mechanism 4. Prebiotic fermentation substrate for beneficial bacterial recolonization. The fourth mechanism is the one that converts a temporary intervention into a permanent microbiome transformation. while carvacrol, thymol, and rosmarinic acid are clearing pathogenic bacteria, disrupting protective biofilms, and repairing the epithelial barrier. The fiber and polysaccharide components of whole oregano leaf are simultaneously providing fermentation substrates for the beneficial bacterial species that will re-establish competitive dominance in the vacated ecological niches. This prebiotic effect is why whole leaf oregano, consumed as an aqueous extraction, which preserves the fiber matrix, produces superior and more durable outcomes compared to oregano essential oil or isolated carvacrol supplements, which deliver the antimicrobial compounds without the prebiotic fiber that enables beneficial bacterial recolonization. You cannot simply eliminate the pathogenic bacteria and expect the ecosystem to restore itself spontaneously if you are not simultaneously providing the nutritional environment that beneficial bacteria need to grow and establish dominance. The prebiotic polysaccharides in oregano leaf are selectively fermented by Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium species, producing the short-chain fatty acids that lower intestinal pH to levels that further suppress pathogenic bacterial growth. This creates a self-reinforcing ecological restoration process where the antimicrobial activity clears the competitive advantage of pathogenic species, and the prebiotic activity fuels the re-establishment of beneficial species that then maintain the restored environment through their own metabolic products. Now, here is the exact morning protocol based on what the research supports. The preparation is 1 heaping teaspoon, approximately 3 to 4 grams, of dried organic whole leaf oregano steeped in 200 milliliters of water, heated to just below boiling, between 85 and 90 degrees Celsius, for 12 to 15 minutes. Boiling water degrades carvacrol through thermal decomposition. The sub-boiling steep temperature extracts carvacrol and thymol from the leaf matrix while preserving their molecular integrity. The steep duration of 12 to 15 minutes is the minimum required to extract sufficient rosmarinic acid, which has a slower aqueous extraction rate than the volatile compounds carvacrol and thymol. After steeping, strain the liquid through a fine mesh strainer and consume the tea preparation on an empty stomach 30 to 45 minutes before your first meal of the day. The empty stomach is not optional. The pH of the fasted stomach between 1 and 2 is significantly more favorable for carvacrol's membrane disruption activity against gram-negative bacteria than the elevated gastric pH that follows meal consumption. From clinical practice, here are 4 clinical details that make the difference between partial and transformative results. First, use organic oregano exclusively. Conventionally grown oregano frequently contains pesticide residues, including organophosphate compounds, that are directly toxic to beneficial gut bacterial species, at concentrations well within those found on commercially available dried herbs. You are investing this protocol specifically to restore beneficial bacterial populations. Using non-organic oregano risks simultaneously damaging the species you are attempting to support. Second, consistency during the first 3 weeks is absolute. The biofilm disruption process requires sustained thymol exposure to progressively degrade the structural matrix that pathogenic bacteria have built over months or years. Missing several days during the initial 3 weeks allows the biofilm to partially regenerate its organizational coherence, requiring the disruption process to essentially restart. After 6 weeks of consistent use, the biofilm architecture is sufficiently degraded that occasional missed days do not significantly compromise the outcome. Third, increase water intake significantly during the first 2 weeks of the protocol. As biofilms are disrupted and gram-negative bacteria are eliminated, their lipopolysaccharide endotoxin content is released into the intestinal space. Adequate water intake facilitates intestinal motility that clears this endotoxin load efficiently. Inadequate water intake during the initial clearing phase can result in temporary worsening of inflammatory symptoms as endotoxin accumulates faster than it is cleared. Fourth, add a small amount of raw honey to the prepared tea if the taste is difficult. Not honey dissolved before steeping, but added after cooling slightly. Raw honey contains compounds that act synergistically with oregano's thymol to further suppress quorum sensing, and the oligosaccharide content of raw honey provides additional prebiotic substrate. Refined sugar is not an acceptable substitute as it preferentially feeds the pathogenic bacterial species oregano is attempting to eliminate. The common mistakes that prevent results. Using oregano essential oil drops in water, believing they are equivalent to or superior to the whole herb aqueous preparation. Essential oil preparations deliver concentrated carvacrol and thymol, but are completely devoid of rosmarinic acid, prebiotic fiber, and the micronutrient cofactors present in whole herb preparations. Essential oil at high oral doses also carries risk of intestinal mucosal irritation that the whole herb preparation does not, because the fiber matrix moderates the rate of bioactive compound delivery to the intestinal mucosa. Expecting improvement in bloating symptoms within the first week. Bloating symptoms frequently worsen slightly during days 3 through 10 of the protocol as biofilm degradation releases bacterial metabolites and endotoxins into the intestinal space. This temporary increase in symptoms is evidence that the protocol is working, not evidence that it should be discontinued. Patients who discontinue during this period due to the temporary worsening universally report that symptoms return to baseline, and they attribute the protocol's failure to inefficacy rather than to premature discontinuation. Combining the morning protocol with antibiotics or pharmaceutical antimicrobials in the same period. The combined antimicrobial load during concurrent use eliminates the selectivity advantage that makes oregano superior to antibiotics for microbiome restoration. If you are on prescribed antibiotics, complete the antibiotic course and begin the oregano protocol at the end of that course, not during it. Let's lock in everything we've covered. Chronic bloating, irregular digestion, and persistent gut discomfort in adults over 50 are not inevitable consequences of aging. They are the predictable outcome of gut dysbiosis, specifically the competitive overgrowth of gram-negative, pathogenic, and opportunistic bacteria that have established protective biofilms on the intestinal mucosa and are releasing endotoxins that damage intestinal barrier integrity and drive systemic inflammation. Oregano, consumed as a morning aqueous preparation of whole dried leaf, addresses this dysbiosis through 4 simultaneous mechanisms. Carvacrol selectively disrupts the outer membrane of pathogenic gram-negative bacteria while leaving beneficial gram-positive species intact. Thymol disrupts biofilm quorum sensing, collapsing the protective structures that have made pathogenic bacteria resistant to conventional interventions. Rosmarinic acid upregulates tight junction protein expression, repairing the intestinal barrier damage that chronic dysbiosis has caused. And whole leaf prebiotic fiber provides the fermentation substrate that enables beneficial bacteria to re-establish competitive dominance in the restored intestinal environment. This is not a folk remedy. It is a mechanistically understood, research-supported intervention that addresses the actual cause of digestive dysfunction rather than managing symptoms with temporary relief. The Georgetown Biofilm Research, the University of Lisbon Selectivity Studies, and the Harvard Intestinal Permeability Trials collectively paint a picture of an herb with extraordinary specificity and efficacy that the modern health industry has overlooked because it costs less than $3 and has been growing in Mediterranean gardens for 4,000 years. Your gut ecosystem is not permanently compromised. The beneficial bacterial communities that produce your neurotransmitter precursors, regulate your immune function, and maintain your intestinal integrity are suppressed, not destroyed. They are waiting for the competitive environment to shift back in their favor. You can begin shifting that environment tomorrow morning with a preparation that costs pennies and takes 10 minutes, and that delivers mechanisms no commercial probiotic product has ever been able to offer. The digestive discomfort you have been told to accept is not the price of getting older. It is a microbial problem with a botanical solution that the modern world forgot and that you found today. Let me address something that I believe deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions of gut health interventions. The systemic consequences of unresolved gut dysbiosis extend far beyond digestive symptoms. This matters because many people who would benefit most from this protocol dismiss it because they frame their digestive discomfort as merely inconvenient rather than as the clinical signal it actually represents. When the integrity of the intestinal barrier is compromised by pathogenic bacterial biofilm activity, lipopolysaccharide endotoxins from gram-negative bacterial cell walls enter circulation continuously. This circulating endotoxin load activates toll-like receptor 4 on immune cells throughout the body, triggering systemic inflammatory cytokine production that extends the consequences of gut dysbiosis far beyond the digestive tract. The chronic, low-grade systemic inflammation driven by intestinal permeability is now understood to be a significant contributing factor to insulin resistance, cognitive decline, cardiovascular inflammatory burden, joint pain, and mood dysregulation in older adults. This means that what presents clinically as bloating and irregular digestion is the visible, subjective surface of a process that is simultaneously driving systemic inflammation affecting every major organ system. Addressing gut dysbiosis through the oregano protocol is not simply addressing digestive comfort, it is addressing one of the most significant upstream drivers of the chronic disease burden that characterizes aging in the Western world. I want to give you the full picture of what improvement looks like so that you can recognize it accurately when it occurs. Within the first 2 weeks, the majority of patients report changes in stool consistency and bowel movement regularity. This reflects the shift in intestinal pH that occurs as pathogenic bacterial populations decline and short-chain fatty acid production from beneficial species begins to increase. Some patients experience temporary worsening of gas and bloating during this period as biofilm disruption releases bacterial metabolites. This is the protocol working. Between weeks 3 and 6, patients typically report the most significant reduction in post-meal bloating and in the sense of abdominal distension that many have carried for years. This corresponds to the period when pathogenic biofilm architecture has been sufficiently disrupted to meaningfully reduce gas-producing fermentation in the upper small intestine, while beneficial bacterial populations are establishing sufficient density to produce the pH changes that suppress pathogenic bacterial growth.